Right. Hi, everyone. Welcome to episode 47 of the Transgender School podcast. Last episode, you might remember, we talked about trans issues in politics and the manosphere with our friend Sophia. Today, we're back with Sophia. We're going to talk a little bit more about her own story and some of the lessons she has for our audience and anyone out there who wants to be an ally to a trans person in their life. A little bit of a quick reintroduction to Sophia. She was in the Navy from 2008 to 2014 as a cryptologic technician technical second class for 2 deployments aboard the USS Mobile Bay. She later served as president of the Student Senate at Fullerton College, studied political economy at UC Berkeley, and is currently serving as a member of the Uptown Community Planning Group in San Diego. Thanks for being with us again today, Sophia.
Yeah, I'm happy to be here.
Well, we're happy to
Yeah,
have
today we're going
you.
to be talking. Today's
Very
the tragedy
happy.
of Sophia.
Yeah, I'm very honored that you're going to share your story with us, Sophia. I've known you for years, but I've never really had an opportunity to hear about all your experiences. So thank you for being willing to be here and share them with us and the audience.
Let's start from the beginning. If you want to introduce yourself to our audience, tell our audience where you were born, where you grew up. Let's start with what those early years of your childhood were like.
I was born in Denver and grew up in Wichita, Kansas. It was a pretty not great situation. My parents were really poor, and Wichita is not that great of a place, in my opinion. No offense to anybody from Wichita. People in Wichita don't like Wichita either. My parents split up. I was 4, something like that, because my dad was beating my mom and all that kind of like abusive stuff. Very sad. And then from there, we moved in with my grandmother in a suburb called Derby, Kansas, where we lived in her basement for a few years. And then after that, we moved to a neighborhood called Oaklawn, which is the very southern bottom tip of Wichita. And it's one of the top 3 most violent neighborhoods in Wichita year after year. So, yeah, so that's like the basis of it. As far as it relates to being trans, growing up in Kansas with Great Depression grandparents, poor family, kind of sticking together like that. We went to church a lot, like every week with my grandma, and she was like a tough as nails, old conservative, culturally conservative kind of person. My aunt was extremely conservative. My mom was the liberal one in the group. That was basically a big feature of my childhood. And I remember when I was in about 6th grade, starting to feel these feelings of wrongness in my own body. It's important to remind everybody that this was 2000, 2001. Nobody knew what being transgender was then. It wasn't a thing. The closest thing that people had to it was a crossdresser or a hermaphrodite. That was how far off the radar this kind of thing was. And so having these kinds of just feelings of profound wrongness, and I was so young and a kid, I remember it changed my relationship to so many things and to so many aspects of my life where suddenly it was socially like, oh God, I think there's something wrong with me. I felt like some sort of freak or like I was being punished by God or something like that. And instead of being in church and hearing about all these good things, it was just me sitting in church feeling like I don't belong there. I shouldn't probably even exist. There's something so profoundly wrong and sinful about me that if anybody in the church knew, then they would have immediately just maybe even killed me or something. They would definitely would have not let me in the church. So that was pretty profound feelings of isolation and confusion that happened. Around that same time, we moved to a pretty violent neighborhood. To put it into perspective, this neighborhood was so pretty crazy that the bus rides, people were constantly getting in fights. People would throw batteries at people's heads, just random people in front of them on the bus. Lots of bullying was happening. It was pretty intense every day on a bus ride. And when people would get accused of various wronging of other people, you would see beating the shit out of this kid. A kid was accused of wronging someone else or disrespecting someone else, or if there was rumors of them being gay or basically anything like that, then you would have situations where 5 or 10 people would get off at their bus stop and follow them home and beat the shit out of them. That wasn't like a fair fight kind of situation. That wasn't a 2v1 or a 3v1. That was like a 5 people versus 1, like an 8 people versus 1. Big herds of kids beating up other kids. And that just continued, as the boys grew and became stronger and more into the teenage years, that became more and more dangerous, more damaging. So I always knew that these kinds of things where you have your family who's all religious in a place like Kansas, it's already pretty not the most open-minded to this kind of stuff. In the 2000s, which was a totally different era, I'm going to use the words, but it was very messed up. It was faggot this, fag that, gay this. Anyone who grew up in that time. I grew up in a Call of Duty lobby, kind of. That kind of thing was very much the zeitgeist in the culture back then. Smear the queer and that kind of stuff. So it was very extremely isolating and extremely scary. And then you combine that with also not knowing what exactly is going on with you, what exactly is wrong with you. You just don't know. Eventually, maybe around 14, I kind of figured out that my gender identity was supposed to be that of like a woman. And that comes through just clues. Like I remember hearing that classic joke from another kid in class that he said that he felt like a lesbian in a man's body. And oh, maybe that's what's wrong with me. And so I started to figure those things out and figure out that that was what was going on and that was what I was experiencing. But that just makes it worse because there's no way to change that. There's no anything that you can do. Yeah, it's just unheard of and radical and insane in so many different ways. That's how it felt back then. I remember in high school, because I was still like pretty religious back then, I would pray for hours every night and like just entire days sometimes, praying that either I would wake up as a girl or I could wake up and have these feelings gone and find a way to be okay. When you're that young and confused and isolated and you have no support and you have just constant 24-hour fear that someone is going to find out, that someone is going to learn, and that when they find out, everyone that you ever loved is going to hate you, is going to disown you, maybe beat the shit out of you, maybe people in my neighborhood will kill you, maybe the police will kill me. You never know what's going to happen. That just intense sort of social isolation for like the 1 or 2 gay kids at our school that nobody came out, obviously, but if they were even suspected of being gay, then they were just, everybody knew. So it was very, very, very scary and very bad in a lot of ways. And then you add on to that the self-hatred that comes with it and the feelings of looking to the future because you're still young and you're still trying to figure out what you're going to do. It just feels so totally hopeless. Lots of depression comes from that. I was depressed a lot when I was a kid. I was profoundly, profoundly shy, which people now struggle to believe. When teachers would call on me in class, I wouldn't even respond. I would just turn completely red and just kind of stare at my desk and just shake my head a little bit and refuse to engage at all. The little jokes and like digs that people make. I had a very masculine name back then, and teachers would make cracks about that. And they didn't mean it in like any sort of bad way or anything. They were just trying to be friendly and nice to a really shy kid. That was really painful. And then a couple of teachers would compliment my eyelashes because I had, I guess, really full eyelashes and say, "Oh, you would make such a pretty girl" and stuff like that. And it was,
I
oh
got
wow,
that.
like
I got that too.
yeah,
Yeah.
exactly. And
That's a
it's
fun one.
yeah, you're, oh, if only you knew. And on the lighter note of things, there was a funny one. One of my friends, she actually, most people I think just kind of figured I was just a really shy kid and didn't really talk that much. I just stayed with my group of friends and stuff. This person was a little bit, this girl was a little bit more perceptive. And so she was looking at me one day when we were working on a project and she was like, "What are you?" She was like, "Are you gay?" And she was like, "I don't think so." And she was, she was like, "Are you a girl?" And then she said, "You would make the worst girl ever." It was just, yeah, I was like, wow, that is very, very
And
specific.
you were how old when she said this to you?
I was like 16 or 17 or something.
Okay, so maybe some
Yeah.
people do have some sort of mental
Yeah.
powers.
Yeah. It's actually, yeah, it's funny too. And then it goes into, there's always people that aren't gonna actually take it hard, but there's also this fundamental difference between being trans and being just a normal gay person, and that's why you see a lot of people these days trying to divide up the LGB and the T, basically just using those internal divisions and stuff to make a political movement happen. And so my mom actually, one day I was walking through the kitchen and she just stopped me randomly. She's like, "Are you gay?" And I was, "No, I don't think so." I'm trying to figure all this stuff out, and I'm pretty sure I'm attracted to girls and not to guys at all. And I was right about that so far in life. And then she was like, "It'd be okay." And I appreciated her saying that a lot, but you never know if that just applies to being gay or if it applies to being trans as well. You can't really come out and say, "Oh no, it's actually this other thing that's totally different that doesn't exist in society yet." So yeah, just profound isolation, profound feelings of confusion and self-hatred, depression, constant fear. Pretty much sums it all up. I remember at one point, this is how the military thing started. At one time we went to the library and I picked up this book called Warrior Elite by Dick Couch, and it's all about training to become a Navy SEAL and how difficult that stuff is and how impossible that stuff is. And I was about 14 then. That book really clicked with me, and I think it clicked with me because of a couple of factors. A lot of people think that people want to be SEALs because they want to go be badasses and kill people or whatever. They're psychopaths or whatever. The two things that clicked for me was that, one, it sounded like a really big challenge and it sounded straight up impossible. And so that really appealed to me. And the second thing was that, and I think this ties into what I'm talking about, is that teamwork is the overall number one ethos of that community. And I really had that kind of deep desire and longing to be part of a team that would care for each other no matter what and would be there with each other no matter what through thick and thin in life and death situations. So I started training and working out, which was also very difficult because you're exercising and you're shaping your body and you're going through this puberty that is like profoundly wrong, almost torturous every single aspect of your day. And then as you're training and making your body even more wrong, you're also fighting against it yourself. Yeah, that was a unique type of a struggle as well. And then joined ROTC, and then from there graduated and went to college. And looking back at it now, I think a big part of why I wanted to do that as well was because I had this question posed in my mind like every single day as a high schooler of I need to either figure out how to not be a woman and how to be a guy, learn to live like that without killing myself, or I need to transition and just do it. And leave town and go to somewhere else and figure that out, which seemed impossible. Prospect of basically being like a cross-dresser in isolation at the bottom of society for the rest of your life isn't appealing either. And again, that's before we knew that medical interventions existed and you could actually transition like you can now. And so I would just have that struggle every single day. Part of, I think, the appeal of joining the military as well was the concept that I could go and do something heroic, combat zone, and maybe be the one to jump on the grenade or something, or run out and grab someone that had been injured and help them, and then die, and it wouldn't be a suicide and it wouldn't be shameful. And the thought process on that isn't so much shame about suicide. It's more, if I'm going to die anyways, if there's no point in me living, I might as well use that to help someone else who does want to live and does want to exist. So yeah, so that was basically high school.
I think, yeah, and I think that's a good point to jump in and ask a question. I mean, there's a lot of questions I could ask based on that, but I think there's a thread running through it that you just closed on of violence, and of violence as the ultimate product of this combination of religion and cultural conservatism and poverty and suspicion and hate. And it struck me, like, you used the example of playing Smear the Queer in school. That was still a thing when I was in elementary. I was probably in elementary school when you were in middle school, and that was very much a thing. And I actually remember getting in trouble for playing Smear the Queer. That my friends and I were playing that game, and school staff came out and told us, "You have to stop," and they, like, broke us up and physically separated us and didn't allow us to continue doing it. And I think that is, I'm assuming that's probably a product of the fact that I grew up in the suburbs of LA and you were growing up in a very different community in Kansas. And I wonder how the adults in this scenario were responding, or I guess rather not responding, to this violence. Was there this tacit acceptance of, if you are a certain way, if you violate these norms, people are going to carry out violence against you, and that's just what happens, and we're not going to do anything about it? How was that unfolding?
I don't know if I would say there would have been like an official community getting together and forming a lynch mob or something like that. But I do think that if, say, a group of teenage boys decided to beat the shit out of a gay kid, no one is going to look at it too hard. No one is going to care about it too much. The police might not be better. Parents regularly disowned gay children in these areas, in these groups, and they still do today. So even if you did get beat up for being gay, you don't want to tell your parents what really happened. There would be very little repercussions, I would say. I would not have expected anyone who committed violence against me to have any official repercussions whatsoever. The only repercussions would be me going on a revenge spree or something, which would be insane, and then escalation and more violence and more hate. That's another thing about it when I think about all the suffering of that childhood. I think about how totally unnecessary it all is. Nothing changed in society once we had this acceptance movement. Nothing catastrophic happened. Nothing went wrong. The only thing that happened is that now when young people like me feel the way that they feel, they can get assistance for it and not have to go through those years of suffering. There was all this hatred and negative thinking and like regressive thinking that just didn't help anybody in any way. And in fact, what it did was deeply and profoundly harm people. And there's a generation of LGBT adults now that can speak to that and have been speaking to it since we've been more open about these conversations. And that's the thing about trauma and the bad things that happen to you, is that you can heal from them and you can recover from them, but you always went through the experience. There's no undo button on hurting others. which is part of why you have to take a stand now. And like you're saying with the allyship and helping people be allies, is that it really does make a difference, and it really does have big interventions with helping people. You know, it makes a big difference, and a positive difference in people's lives.
So I really appreciate that, and I would love to come back to your story. I know we left off, I think, high school-ish. You're praying a lot. You're wishing that you were not feeling this way about yourself, and you're starting to have thoughts about the military seeming like an attractive option. So if you want to kind of keep telling your story from that point, I think we would love to pick up from there.
Yeah, so I did end up joining the military. That got me out of Kansas and into the military, did boot camp, and at my training command, that was where you get your first little bit of freedom after you join the military. Got my first computer, got an iPhone. That was my first mobile phone, my first cell phone. And then I was on the internet. And I remember that was when I figured out that being trans is a thing, because I could search up how I was feeling, and I could try to figure out to solve the problem that I had. We didn't really have the internet too much at my place. And I definitely wasn't going to risk like searching that up on the family computer and then start opening that whole can of worms. I figured it out, and then it's hard to find the right words for this, but I'm a pretty skeptical person in general, I would say. And so when I first learned that being trans was a thing, I still was kind of, okay, but what is that? Like, what causes it? What does the medical research say on this? What is the experience of people going through this? What are the treatments and what do they do and that kind of stuff? And so I did just a lot of research at that time, and read a lot of medical papers, and saw a lot of people's experiences with transitioning and all that type of stuff. And the evidence seemed like it would help, and it seemed like it's a real thing that's always existed in humans. The more that I learned about it, the more that I felt like less of a freak, the more that I felt, okay, so this is just having wisdom teeth, more painful than wisdom teeth, but it's the same level of natural variation in humans. That helped me a lot. The problem then is that I was still in the military. So what would happen at this point in my career is the military is maybe even scarier than Kansas to be gay in at the time. And I had a job with a security clearance. Back then, this was, again, a different time. This was before therapy was talked about. This was before psychoanalysis was seen as helpful. This was before people cared about how people in the military's well-being was. This was, you do what you do, you shut the fuck up and you get it done. If you have problems, you fucking handle them. If you go and see a psychiatrist or a psychologist and you have a clearance, you're getting your clearance taken away almost de facto immediately. There would be no investigation or contemplation about it. It would be, okay, you're done. And then you would get either kicked out of the military. In the case of being any sort of LGBT, that is exactly what would happen by policy. You would get kicked out. And then the best case scenario is that they don't find out that you're LGBT, and they just give you a really crappy job as like a ditch digger or a cook or something like that. Still pretty bad. Still massive threats of violence. Still threats of having your job taken away from you, having your career ended. And I still wanted to try to be a SEAL at that time. So the way that worked was, they basically told me, everyone in the military basically told me that if I went in and did really well and became like a top performer, then I would get my chance, and that's fine. So I worked extremely, extremely hard during this time to get top of my class. I got top of my class 8 or 9 classes in a row. Like 100% of the classes that I was in, I was top of the class. I got meritoriously promoted. One of my friends, he was even a hater. He didn't even want to compliment me. He said that I was the most squared away sailor on the entire base on Corey Station. My uniforms, I would iron my uniforms every single night. My life at that time was really just, I would study 12 to 14 hours a day, 16 hours a day sometimes, and then come home, iron my uniform again. I would iron my uniform every single day. I would shine my boots to a mere shine. I would run and exercise until about midnight or midnight 30, and then I would sleep for 5 or 6 hours and then go back and do the same thing the next day. I didn't take breaks in the classes. One of our instructors actually came up and he teased me about it. He came up and he said, "You should stop studying and go take a break like a normal person, you nerd." And I was, okay. I don't think that's a very professional thing to say, and you shouldn't be discouraging people from studying. Like, I'm gonna do this, and I'm gonna do it.
But maybe not the worst advice.
Oh no, I mean, he was completely right. I was psychopathically focused on just trying to succeed as much as I could because I really wanted to do this. The way I saw it was I was paying a sacrifice to try to pursue this dream that genuinely spoke to me. But the sacrifice that I had to make was not living an authentic life as a woman and not transitioning when I was young, which I think every trans person, once they learn what's wrong with them, they understand that there's kind of a ticking time bomb. And the further away from puberty and the further away from being young that you get, the less well your transition is going to work out. We see that, I talked about this in the last video too, and we see that today with people judging trans people based on how well they pass and giving them preferential treatment based on how well they pass. And I don't think that's something that like a law can solve. That's probably just like human nature, and people have always been mean to fat people and stuff like that. Yeah, so you definitely have this clock running at the back of your head, and I felt like I was paying that sacrifice to try to do something good and to try to accomplish this dream. That never got to happen. And what would happen at this time is I would be going through cycles of feeling dysphoria and feeling profound pressure to transition. And I would fight it and engage in like greater and greater self-hatred and become more and more depressed and more unhappy until, I don't know, like basically break you. And then I would order hormones online. So then you're taking just random pills from some random website in an unsupervised way while you're in the military, hiding those in my room when there's room inspections and stuff.
Probably not ideal on a few levels.
Yeah, no, very scary stuff. Yeah. It's like having a drug stash while you're in the military. It's very scary. And then I would take those pills, and then I would feel better, and the dysphoria would get less bad, and I would get into it far enough that like the physical changes were starting to become visible after 3 or 4 months, and then all the fear would kick in. So the pain goes down, the fear goes back up, and then I would stop and go back through the cycle. And then as the effects wore off and I started feeling more and more dysphoric again, then I would go right back into that cycle. And so that was basically something that continued throughout my entire military career. It's just one of those things where I think that people think that being trans in the military is a bad thing. And I think that what it is being trans in the military without any support is even worse. And there's no way to stop closeted trans people from joining the military. We shouldn't, because we need their talent and support anyways. What it should be is that they should be allowed to serve openly and have supervised medical care and supervised treatments, and that would make the entire thing make way more sense than to say no trans people at all. The military Absolutely. Is hard for everybody. Yeah, the military is hard for anybody, and it's a very stressful job. And being trans and being closeted and having these terrible feelings of isolation and depression and this drive to beat this thing and to overcome this thing that I never wanted to transition, and I wanted to fight it and wake up one day and be fine. That just made all the other stuff, the working extremely hard, the long hours, the lack of food, the dangerous work, all of that much more difficult rather than easy. That's also tough for me because I saw my ship. When I got to my ship, we ended up having a very high operational tempo. We did 2 deployments in 2 years and spent about 2.5 years of out to sea in about a 4-year period. We went through a failed in-serve. Any veterans that are listening to this will shudder at those words. And a failed in-serve is one of the worst things that can happen to you in a military unit. In-serve is the biggest inspection that the Navy does. Failing an in-serve means that there's catastrophically large problems with your ship. And it's such a big deal that it's the commanding officer of your ship is going to get instantly fired. Their career is going to be over. You're all going to be working 20, 22-hour days for months to repair those things. The Navy will elevate the priority of repairing your ship to basically the highest levels possible and throw money at the problem until it gets fixed. It's a very big deal to fail in serve. It's a very big deal. Congressional members get briefed. The president gets briefed on that kind of thing. So we were working and doing these deployments, and our operational tempo was high. And at the end of our second deployment, people were having nervous breakdowns left and right. One of my close friends, was overworked so badly that he had a nervous breakdown and started hysterically crying, and they had to take him away to the chaplain and give him therapy and take him to a hospital for risk of suicide. And when he came back about a week later, he literally had a physical twitch. So every few minutes when you would talk to him, he would twitch. One of my friends that almost became a SEAL, he made it through Hell Week, and he was just a tough, strong guy. He had a mental breakdown when he was going to work one day, snapped, didn't show up for work. None of us knew where he was, turned his cell phone off, was gone for about a month and a half. I thought he was dead. I thought he killed himself. His mother was contacting the ship, trying to find us. The divorce rate, 85% of the ship. We had self-harm going on. We had risk-taking behaviors going on. We had half my friends telling me that they wanted to either kill themselves or kill other people that was working with us. It was extremely, extremely bad times. And to deal with all that stuff on top of being trans and being closeted was pretty beyond words, I would say. Ended up doing my job in the Navy, did it as well as I could. They never gave me my chance to be a SEAL, which is infuriating, but whatever. So when I got the final word on that, I decided that I was going to be getting out. Decided to go to college. And then when I was going to college, I decided that now would be the time to transition. The SEAL dream was dead and gone, and now I was going to be in a situation where I could transition, and then we'll see where the cards fall in terms of like social support and how things work out. And so I got out. I ended up staying with one of my friends in Orange County in a really crappy converted motel apartment. No, there's no room. I was sleeping in a bunk bed above my desk, and he was sleeping on the couch because there's just no space and no privacy, obviously. And for some reason, he at that time came into some sort of interaction with a trans person and said horrific things about if they ever came over to his apartment, he would kill her, just calling her a freak, calling her like disgusting, wow. Really horrible things. And this is one of my best friends. And when you hear that kind of thing in your living situation and you're economically precarious in your first semester of college, you're kind of, oh, you can never find that out about me because you're going to try to kill me. So that was very scary. Started transitioning and then got into a relationship with a girl, a straight girl. And the same kind of thing happened where I figured that I could at least stick it out for a little bit and we could be happy together and maybe even like get married. I could have a couple of children maybe and then transition after or kill myself. one of those two things. And so I figured I could stop treatment again and try to carry on in this relationship because it was good and I was happy and she was happy. And what ended up happening is what probably always happens in that situation, where I became depressed again and miserable and generally unhappy and had a poor relationship to my body. And so that's a great way to tank a relationship. I became very depressed in the winter break, and that was pretty much it. After that, had to put myself back together. The loss of progress and transition, feeling stupid for having done something like that in the first place, the loss of my relationship, and the stress of also carrying a full honors curriculum in college at the same time. Got it back together, pulled myself back together, and then started transitioning again. And this time I tried to learn that lesson and said, I'm not going to stop transitioning for a relationship again.
And you're how old at this point, Sophia?
I was 25 at that point. And so made the decision again, carried forward, and then ended up meeting my future fiance. But this time I did tell her right away that I was trans and I was past that stuff and et cetera, et cetera. Me and her ended up staying friends for a while and then falling in love with each other, moving in together. And then the same kind of situation happened where she, as she was learning about it, discovered that you can't have children if you're trans. And she wanted to have children with me and I wanted to have children with her. And so we made the deal to stop transition again, to stop treatment again. And that was extremely hard because I knew what was going to happen, and she had never met the miserable, depressed version of me that I was about to become. And you can only try to explain that to someone so much when they've met the happy, successful, healthy version of you. And you tell them, like, it's not going to be like this, it's going to be bad, and you're not going to like being around me. I don't like being around me when I'm like this. You know? They're going to think of that as, okay, the good version of you, but a little worse, not a totally different version of you that is unhealthy and is incapable of having a good relationship with their body and is capable of taking care of themselves and stuff like that. That's what ended up happening. Stressed out our relationship a lot, and then a bunch of life stuff happened, and we ended up breaking up. So that's another one down, and then having to put yourself back together again after that. Very hard things. Again, you lose the time. Oh, and another part of it is that I found out that I won't be able to have children. So all of it was for naught in that regard as well. So mourning the loss of my relationship, I'm mourning the loss of people that had died during this time and personal tragedies, mourning the loss of the love of my life, mourning the ability to have children, I'm mourning the wasted time. That's all difficult to deal with, in addition to changing schools, moving across the state, enrolling in, again, an honors curriculum level of courses. And then at the time I was also the student body president of my school. And so having to deal with that stuff.
And then we met and your life turned around.
It's all sunshine and rainbows from there.
Exactly.
No, I would say after that, it was finally, I came out when I was the student body president of my school. And that was actually a positive experience. There was lots of institutional support. And that's the difference between the political environment, where we had Obama as a president and gay marriage had just been legalized, and even conservative people were kind of like, okay, gay people are fine now. We don't really understand this trans thing, but maybe we can learn to live with it together. So it was like a totally different situation. When I came out, it was in the newspaper. The school was, the institutions in the school were kind of like, okay, we have to make sure this goes safe. We have to make sure this goes well. There was talk about possibly getting me security if I needed it. Only a couple people shouted slurs at me, which is a big win. Yeah, so it went pretty positively, and then I went from there. So then my life collapsed again. That's the story. Went to Berkeley, transitioned, and then from there to now is basically just kind of learning to be trans and learning to live in a new way. There's some frustrating aspects of that where you give up a lot of social status, I would say. I was living as like a white man, so I could just talk and people listen to me for no reason. I would say not even smart things, and people in class would sometimes be like, wow, that was really smart.
Funny how that goes
No.
away, huh?
Yeah, exactly. Very frustrating. Now when I actually say smart things, people are like, yeah, fuck you. No one listens or cares. Going from basically a high social status situation where people want to network with you, they want to work with you, they want to see you as a friend, they want to see you as someone to look up to, they want to take your advice, they want to give you advice, to someone who is almost socially a liability if you're hanging out with people and people know that you're trans. It's, why are you hanging out with one of those? And that's not a lot of people in the world, but that's enough people that it is a social liability. You never know if you're going to run into that, say, conservatively 20% of people in California that just don't really like trans people. So that's taking a big hit in the social factor, limiting friends, limiting romantic relationships. Those are all tough. It's frustrating. I've been in a couple of relationships with girls that I think we liked each other. We would hang out, talk all the time. When we'd get drunk together, we would make out and do stuff like that. And then when they were the next day, didn't want to do anything relationship wise or romantically. And
Yeah,
so that
cis guys aren't like that. Cis guys, they come back after the drinking. They're very different.
Yeah, very different. Yeah, so that is definitely part of it. There's an issue that I think exists in human psychology and human success where the closer you are to the successful version of life that you want to have, the easier it is to accomplish and the easier it is to kind of reach out and grab it. Most people want to lose 15 pounds or they want to get a promotion or they want to get their kid into this school or something like that. But overall, they're pretty happy with the rest of their lives. And when you're trans, it adds like a bunch of additional things that you would like to change about yourself that are extremely difficult or impossible to change about yourself. And so when you think about your ideal life and your ideal sense of who you would want to be and how you'd want to live, there's not 2 things or 5 things that you have to change before you can feel like you'll be a happy person. There's 15 or 30 things that some of which are going to be extremely medically intrusive, like surgeries or mostly surgeries, I guess. Stuff that would entail like changing habits, changing behaviors, changing locations, changing jobs. Having another aspect of it is having fields of employment essentially closed to you, being discriminated against. So that's definitely something. I think I was applying as a tutor in Berkeley as a one of the jobs that I wanted to have, and at that time my social security number hadn't been updated to the new name. So they took in my application. They were all excited for me. I had a great resume, lots of experience with teaching and tutoring people. And then when they found out that I was trans because the names didn't line up, then immediately just cut off. So that kind of thing is always really pretty bad. I would love to be a teacher. I love teaching. But most people don't want a trans person or an LGBT person teaching their children. They're going to have a lot of natural suspicion over that. So yeah, just overall, a lot of frustration there. And then in terms of not having been able to transition younger, and kind of all adult trans people who didn't get the chance to transition when they were young probably have the same feeling, where they feel like they're kind of stuck with a body that is halfway to what they want, rather than how much further it could have been otherwise. That sort of dysmorphia never goes away. It gets better, it gets manageable. There's healthier ways to manage it and to deal with it. But that feeling of feeling cheated out of a body that you could have or otherwise should have had for no good reason is always going to be a frustration for every trans person that is forced to go through these types of experiences. Another aspect of it is the box that I feel like people put trans women into, where if you wear dresses and makeup and are fashionable, then you are a caricature of a woman, then you are a fetishist, or you're a sexual freak, or those types of suspicious behaviors and suspicious things. And then if you're not that kind of person like me, I'm still into like camping and shooting guns and fishing and stuff like that. Then people are like, well, why did you transition in the first place? What was the point? And it's all, I think, a fundamental misunderstanding of the experience. I'll keep saying this until I die. I don't think that being trans is an aspirational thing. When people say, how did you know that you wanted to be a woman? It's not because I sat down and thought of myself as like a woman. It's because there was something inside of me that was giving me these feelings that I had to decipher to figure out what my body was telling me. It was a mismatch between something in my body with the gender identity and its relationship to my body and to my experience in life with what my physical form was. It's not you have this image of yourself in like whatever. It's a response. It's an escape. It's a running away from pain. It's a running away from a problem that you have, trying to solve that problem. And I think that's something very important that people very much misunderstand. And so when you have, yeah,
I've heard it described as a static. There's kind of a static noise, like if the TV was just on a static channel, and that's just constantly in the back of your head, and it gradually gets turned up over the course of your life, and it just gets louder and louder and louder until you can't ignore it, and then eventually it just completely overwhelms you.
yeah, I would say that's a great way to think about it too. I've also thought about it in terms of Chinese water torture, where you have the classic drip,
Yeah.
drip, drip, and at first anyone can withstand the dripping, and then by the end of a day, that person is screaming, in agony and all that kind of thing. And I would say that's pretty similar to the experience of being trans. And then transitioning would be something like stopping the water, or at least turning it mostly off. You can withstand it a little bit easier. So that's pretty much overall the story of me and being trans. Lots of fear, lots of isolation, lots of frustration, lots of self-harm, self-hatred. And it gets better when you are able to come out, when you're able to have supportive people, when you're able to handle these medical issues, when you're able to get assistance for this problem. That's the overall thing, is that was, call it from 2000 to 2015 was when I came out. 15 years of pretty profound emotional, spiritual, physical torture. I feel pretty comfortable using the word torture there. Social torture as well, social isolation. Instead of that, my life could have been, okay, we have this problem. We're going to get support. We're going to get help for it. We're going to talk to doctors. We're going to figure out what the problem is, and then we're going to solve it. That would have saved 15 years of terrible, terrible experiences. And my life would have been completely different, and it would have been a completely different trajectory. I probably never would have joined the military. I might have gone to college or just had a good job or something. I wouldn't have felt this drive to destroy myself.
I'm curious. I think the lesson here for non-trans people is pretty obvious, which is to support trans people in their transitions, to create a space where they feel like they can transition, they can come out, and they can be supported. But I'm curious, Sophia, what you would say, because I think there's these themes throughout your story of putting your transition on hold for external reasons, whether it's your career and your aspirations or a relationship and a desire to have kids, that there was this constant, I'm going to wait to do what I know I need to do because someone else needs something from me, or maybe even I have to prove something to myself and to society at large that I can be someone, that I can do something before I can even be allowed to consider that or think about it or deal with it. And so what would you say to a young trans person who is feeling the same way you did? And what advice would you give them?
I guess this is what I would say. I didn't want to transition. I saw it as something that was a problem that maybe I could solve through willpower and through just getting over it or toughing it out. And I tried to do that for 15 years and it didn't work out. And you can probably figure out how to do it in a lot faster, that you're not going to beat it in a lot faster of a time. And that's exactly why we have the medical standards and the medical checklists and the medical diagnoses that we have, and why it's important to do these things with a team of caring professionals. If I had been a child, say 11 or 12, had been in a context where I could just tell my mother, hey, I'm feeling this way, live in a world where everyone said, oh, we know what that is, we're going to make a doctor's appointment, go in, start that stuff, get tested. Turns out I was trans all the way back then. Who could have known? Then that's exactly what it is. It would have saved all that time. After that, because of the context in which I lived, I didn't want to do it. I didn't want to change who I was. I didn't want to live like a lower life. I didn't want to be hated by my family and be disowned by people that I care about and be loved. I didn't want to lose the ability to have a family. I didn't want to lose my romantic partners. I didn't want to not take care of my family. I was taking care of my family for a significant portion of the amount of time in the story. I would say that people need to realize that if they have these symptoms and they have these experiences and they have these problems, that they need to figure out if it's a real thing or get medical treatment, talk to a therapist, talk to psychiatrists, talk to your loved ones, talk to your family, and try to get into, if you're not in a supportive context, try to get to a supportive context. I think that's a very important thing too. There's still, I live in the gayborhood here now, and so I get to walk past the clubs of happy LGBT people of every stripes pretty often as I'm walking in the evening. And when I see those crowds of people, what I see is so many children who felt alone and isolated and scared from all over the country, from all over the world when they were younger. And now they live in a place where they can be themselves and they can be happy and they can love who they need to love and they can learn to love themselves as well. And so when I walk past these clubs, I don't necessarily see people dancing and drinking. What I see is people finally getting to live as a full human experience, a full human life that everybody deserves to live. And I think if you're in a bad context, in a bad situation, if you're still in rural Kansas or you're still in Georgia or Utah, then you should try to get to a better context, absolutely, because those definitely exist. There's places in the world that have protections for trans people, that have socially inclusive institutions and environments where you won't be bullied or under the threat of violence for being who you are and living your life.
That's a really powerful way to think about this. And it comes back to this idea that I know we've talked about, Sophia, that the more accepting cities, because I see the same thing here in San Francisco. I live a 15-minute walk from the Castro, and I worked for the local city council member who represented the neighborhood. And it's such a powerful experience to be in a community that is so openly queer and so openly accepting in every way that a community can be in America in 2024. And so I feel like I just have to plug the fact that cities like San Diego and San Francisco and LA that have these accepting neighborhoods and these accepting communities have, in my opinion, a real moral obligation to build a lot more housing and to actually create accessible opportunities for trans people and queer people to live there, because I think that's the big reason that so many of those kids from Kansas and all those other places don't make it to these places, or if they do make it here, they end up homeless now because we don't have affordable entry-level housing for queer people. I mean, you thinking about your story, your housing was not ideal when you got to California, but there was something. There was a renovated Motel 6 for you to sleep in a bunk bed in. And I fear that we don't have that nowadays in a lot of these cities, or that we don't have anywhere near the scale of that sort of thing that we would need to actually provide a loving, accepting environment for all the people who are fleeing these hostile situations across the country.
I 100% agree with you. And talking about housing prices, I'm a pretty great barometer because I've lived in California since 2010 and moved 30 times here because of going for school and work and all that type of stuff. So I'm always subject to the exact market rate at the time, which is great. And I used to be able to rent that first room in Orange County for $600. Then I rented another room in Orange County for $600. And then before that, in San Diego, I was renting a one bedroom apartment for about $1,100, $1,200. Nowadays, that apartment would be $2,000, $2,100. Going up to the Bay Area, watching the prices in Berkeley rise in real time, where I rented a cabin for $1,200 and then it was $1,400. And then a split room, sharing a room with another student for $1,200. And then having another room, a really small one bedroom that was my own, for I think it was $1,500. Every year, almost, you see $100, $200, $300 added onto the various rents. Same thing happened here when I moved in here. 2 bedroom apartment, 1850, and then in 4 years, it's gone up to $2,700. So something like a 50, almost 50% increase. Gone up about $900 off an initial $1,850 rent. That's not sustainable for anybody. Incomes don't go up that fast. No matter what your job is, you're not going to be able to keep affording that kind of stuff. It's a massive, massive problem. And you're correct that in terms of living in the neighborhoods and these kinds of places that have another moral dimension to it besides the economics of housing and income inequality, in terms of LGBT equality and inclusion. Yeah, we need to handle the housing stuff here for sure. We need to handle it everywhere, but there's an additional dimension, as you identified, to these places.
So that's a plug for episode 42 of our podcast, How the Housing Crisis Impacts LGBTQ People. We could do a whole podcast on housing and queer issues, and I would actually love to
Yeah.
do that. But that aside, I just want to come back to your story a little bit, Sophia, and I want to kind of tie things up here on a note of do you feel that things in the military have improved? Because you talked about serving from 2008 to 2014. I know that Don't Ask, Don't Tell was still in effect for probably half of the time, roughly, that you were in the military, that you've seen this trans ban that Trump implemented when he was president. You talked in our last episode about how that personally impacted you. So for a young trans person who was interested in joining the military today, who knows they're trans and wants to serve openly, what advice would you have for them? Do you think that's going to be a more accepting environment than it was when you were there?
Well, I'm not, and now, so it's always hard to get your finger on the pulse quite accurately. But I just based on policies and the attitude of society in the military, I think it's absolutely going to be better than it was when I was in. And that's the importance of having leadership that leads from a place of empathy and practicality rather than a place of just political nonsense. And there's no reason other than the political to eliminate trans people, to eliminate gay people from the military. Gay people and trans people were always in the military. They're always going to be in the military, and there's no way to stop that from happening. What you can do is have a pragmatic, mission-focused attitude about it, a perspective about it, where you say that we can't do anything to stop this problem. What we can do is we can make their lives not a living hell so that they can do their jobs better. I definitely think that we're taking steps towards that. So I know that mental health and emotional well-being is more seriously taken in the military now, which is another great example of the same type of political-based nonsense versus pragmatic policymaking, where, yes, you're in the military, it's an extremely high-stress job. No matter who you are, no matter how strong you are, you're going to probably at some point need some sort of mental interventions and mental health interventions. That's just a sensible policy that helps the mission get done better. The only reason not to do that is because of politics, because we can't have our big, strong men in the military looking like a bunch of sissy ninnies crying to a therapist. That's the only reason that you could have to be opposed to having people take care of themselves and be healthy. What a disaster it would be if the people serving our country were healthy.
I think that's such a good point, though, because when Vice President Harris said that, I forget exactly when she said this, but she said at some point, I think maybe during the debate, that she wants us to have the most lethal fighting force in the world. And there were some reactions to that on Twitter. I saw some people like, what the hell is that? What does she mean, the most lethal fighting force? But that, I think that's brilliant messaging, and I think that's correct, because if we are going to have the most lethal fighting force, if we are going to have the most powerful military, which is ostensibly the goal of our military, then we can't let small, petty little shit like this, and like whether people
Exactly.
need mental health care or whether people are trans, we can't let that impact who we're allowing to serve. It has to be merit-based. It has to be who is the person that's most fit to fill this job and do this thing that we need to do. And so I think that's great messaging. And I love to hear that from her. And that gives me hope that these institutions will become more accessible for queer people and trans people over time, because I know that people, especially in the LGBT community, people in the more liberal, left-leaning political communities have complicated feelings about the military, but it's a huge mechanism of upward mobility. It's a huge opportunity. And if you close that off to certain groups of people, that has a really detrimental impact to people who are already at a disadvantage because of the different identities that they have.
Yeah. The middle class was built in the post-World War II era by the GI Bill and the VA Home Loan Program, from which Black Americans were excluded, which is a leading factor in why white Americans have a net worth 11 times higher than Black families. Right there, it's a hugely important institution, getting even outside of the fact that national defense is an important part of a nation state's existence. As far as what you said about the military as well, you're totally right about the talent. And you're totally right about how it's important that we take care of our service members and we get the best people. My friends that I was talking about that had mental breakdowns, who were by far not the only ones that this happened to. Probably a third of the ship either had a mental breakdown or was on the verge of a mental breakdown. And probably close to 100% of us at some point had those types of experiences and those types of thoughts. It's just what happens when you're working in a very intense situation for a very long amount of time. What happened with my friend when he had a mental breakdown is he was one of the best Spine 1 radar technicians that we had on our ship. He was one of the best operators that we had on our ship, which is a very important part of fighting a ship. And we lost him for a week, 2 weeks, before he could put himself back together to a basic level of functionality. And his performance was probably 60% of what it was before he had a mental breakdown. If we could have had an intervention to stop that, then we would have had that much more of a lethal fighting force. When you talk about the military winning in engagements and getting the mission done, success is in the margins. It's having a better crew. It's having a better team. It's having people who respond to stress better. It's having people who know their job better. When we did straight up from Moose deployments, we didn't send our B team up. We had the A team every time. There's a difference between different operators and different people in the military. They're not interchangeable cogs. They're human beings. The same thing with the friend that we thought had killed himself. Singularly, the best ASTAC controller that I ever worked with in the military. They're the people that do basically liaison with the helicopters and do the flight operations for helicopters, which is an incredibly important asset for ships. That's one of the most important jobs that you could possibly do in modern surface combat environment, and we lost him. We lost him for 6 months. That's not getting the mission done. That's not taking care of people. That's not having a successful organization. All it is, and again, it's frustrating too because there's no reason against it. There's no lack of resources. The only reason against it is because it makes us look soft to have our service members talking to therapists. It makes us look soft to allow trans people and gay people in the military. It doesn't tickle some fat redneck in Ohio's beer guzzling belly to think about me as an EW specialist instead of Brad Pitt. If they know anything about war in the first place. A lot of the things in my life that I get frustrated about the most have to do with the fact that we just let politics overtake the mission, that we let politics stand in the way of success, that we let politics stand in the way of overall more human achievement, overall more human flourishing, overall more national excellence. We're giving up all those great things and getting nothing in return except for some people doesn't get the ick when they think about the military, that were never in the military to begin with, that don't like paying their taxes.
Well, and that's why I'm glad you're getting back into public service. And I think this community planning group will just be the start of that. And I look forward to seeing how that continues to grow, because I think that you have a lot to offer, and I think that we'll see what happens. Put it that way.
Well, I appreciate that. That's very nice of you to say. We'll see what happens.
We'll have you back on the podcast. I have a feeling we'll have you back on the podcast, and there will be more to talk about.
All right. That sounds good. That about summarizes the tragic life of Sophia.
Well, I think you describe it as tragic, but I hope that it's a very educational story for our audience, and I hope that they're able to take away some really important lessons from this. And I really appreciate the vulnerability that you showed today to come on this show and to share this and to share so many deeply personal aspects of your life and your own experiences. And I really do think that there's a lot of value in that, and we wouldn't have asked you to do that if there wasn't. So thanks for doing that.
I also totally agree. That's one of the things that I think we need to look at is the LGBT movement as an intergenerational movement. We had Stonewall handing us the rights that we got, our forebears, and now we have to do the fight, and we have to set things up for the next generation so that they can have things even better. It's the intergenerational progress of all Americans and all of America and all parents and all citizens, but it's also particularly important with the LGBT people, especially with how we're coming under fire as we speak right now. So if this is one of those ways that I can help in that project, then I will absolutely always do it.
Thank you, Sophia. I just want to chime in and say I had thought that I would jump in and ask questions, but I just wanted to hear your story and everything you shared. I learned a lot from what you shared. And honestly, I think if I had to pick any episode that I would send to a parent, now this would be it, because you addressed almost every issue that I think parents and people in the communities that we're in the world that we're in, don't understand at all. And for you to have gone into the deeper explanations of what you experienced and the struggles and the going back and forth, and so many parents will say, well, why didn't my kid just tell me? And Oh my God. Like if you didn't answer that
Yeah.
question more beautifully than I've ever heard anybody answer it, then I don't know what happened here. Cause that's how I see everything you shared. It took us deeper and shed more light and helped us understand on a much more human level some of those issues that we talk about on the more surface level. We can give statistics or we can say these are the things that are happening. But Jackie's experience is really different from yours. Jackie's had a lot of struggle as a trans person, but I think she would agree, very different from yours. And we've told her story and our story a lot on the podcast,
Yeah.
and your story absolutely needs to be one that people hear. So I can't thank you enough for sharing it. And I had no interest in jumping in at any point. I just wanted you to keep going. And I was just saying, thank you, thank you, thank you, thank you for everything that you're sharing because it will help people understand a lot more.
Well, that's a lot of very, very kind things for you to say, and I really appreciate it. Hopefully people do. It helps people. That's the important thing.
All right. Well, thanks for listening, everyone. And we'll see you on the next one.
Bye. Thanks, everybody.